On today's episode, I have the honor of talking with Dr. Jeff Wiese about how he uses coaching skills in his teaching of residents. Produced by Innovate Learning, maximizing human potential. Welcome to this episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. This is Bonnie Stachowiak, and this is the space where we explore the art and science of being more effective at facilitating learning. We also share ways to increase our personal productivity approaches so we can have more peace in our lives and be even more present for our students. Hello and welcome to this episode of Teaching in Higher Ed. This is episode 96. We're getting close to the 100th episode. I'm really excited. Today I am welcoming on the show Dr. Jeffrey Wiese. He is a professor of medicine at Tulane University Health Sciences Center, and he's the Senior Associate Dean for Graduate Medical Education, also at Tulane University. He is the Associate Chairman of Medicine, the Chief of the Charity Medical Service, and the Director of the Tulane Internal Medicine Residency Program, which he'll be sharing about with us today. He's also served as the Course Director for the Clinical Diagnosis, Biostatistics, Advanced Internal Medicine, and Medical Education courses. And I'll be linking to his bio, which is quite impressive, written over 100 articles, books, and book chapters, and has made over 300 presentations to national and international audiences. And how I first heard about him is through Doug McKee, who's been on Teaching in Higher Ed a few times in the past. And he also has a podcast that he does with Edward O'Neill. And back on their episode number 27, which was with Jeff Connors, and he talked about teaching clinical reasoning. And Jeff Connors is with Yale's School of Medicine. And in his episode, he talked about really how he has approached teaching, and he joked that he stole all his ideas from Dr. Jeff Wiese, who he says was just so influential in his teaching, a real master educator. And he said, and I quote, "This educator just grabs you." And as I was listening to him talk about Jeff, I thought, I want to talk to that guy. And I'm so happy to be welcoming him to the show today.
Well, thanks for having me, Bonnie. And yeah, you'll have to remind me to send $20 to Jeff Connors for throwing my name out there, but very proud of him. Fulfilling that exponential component that I think is core to all of teaching, right?
Absolutely. One of the things I did as soon as I found out who you were was to go to your teaching portfolio, and you really have put together a truly profound piece of work about your teaching philosophy and some of your approaches to teaching, and that's really what we're going to talk about today. One of the things you start out with is this idea of 4 phases of physician development. And would you talk a little bit about those phases? And I know we're going to spend a lot of time on the 4th one.
Yeah, I'm happy to. And, so it doesn't sound judgmental as I go through these stages. This has been sort of my own development into education. I think that most people start out sort of leaving that learning space and moving into the teaching space and think, well, I need to teach in the same way that I learned. And that largely boils down to trying to collect every single piece of data that went into that topic. And in some ways, I'll put it this way, it's almost proving to yourself that you know the content and that you're capable enough to be able to teach it to somebody else. The problem is you get so lost in the details, and it becomes, as I tell my students, my residents, you get so lost in the details and proving to yourself that you know it, that you skip past whether this, 1, knowledge was even retained by the people that you're teaching, and 2, did it really change anything in the way of making them better at the knowledge, skill, or attitude that you were trying to advance in them. And somewhere along the line, if you teach enough, then you start to get some approbations for, hey, thanks for teaching me, and no lie, that feels good. I think anybody that's been in the teaching space loves that, and there's nothing wrong with it. The problem is that if that starts to take over as the full motivation of why you're teaching, then you quickly find yourself into, well, as an artist would put it, once you start pandering to public opinion, you've given away your art. You may be teaching what they want to hear to get more of those approbations, but not necessarily what they need to hear in the way of being effective in changing the world around them. And phase 3, it's largely a form fuse to phase 2. It's about trying to garner the teaching awards and recognitions and those social macro approbations that for anybody in academics becomes important in the way of promotion, et cetera, et cetera. And again, nothing wrong with recognitions. It's just a quick slope where your art of focusing on, am I improving the performance of people that are my students, is that sliding towards trying to gain those social approbations, or is it actually improving them? And then phase 4 is where you ultimately land. And, I'm going to talk about this, Bonnie, in the context of being a physician, but I think anybody that's teaching in any quarter can relate that, as I tell my residents and people that I teach, there's going to be a day where you turn the corner on some lonely hospital ward and you look down that hallway and you see some past student, intern, resident, somebody that you taught along the way doing right by a patient because of what you empowered them to do. And on that day, there is no one there to pat you on the back, no one there to give you the accolades or the awards. In fact, nobody will even know it. But you'll know it. And you'll know in that moment that in small part you changed the world in a better way. And that phase 4 consciousness of, it's not about me. It's about what will be the manifestation in this life that I'm touching, and how will they be better enabled to change the world around them because of the time that we spent together. And if you can hold that image in the back of your mind, then I think that all the rest that we talk about in the way of teaching sort of falls into place.
To me, the system of higher ed really rewards that third phase. It's all shaped around that. I mean, in fact, talking about at many institutions that have tenure, you start on day 1 and you're going to lose your job in 7 years unless you do something to keep it. So it's a very strange thing. Do you think that everyone eventually gets to this 4th phase of seeing it more from a distance, the impact you have, and it being less about ego? Or do you think some people get stuck along the way?
Well, I think that, and hopefully in our time together, I have time to bring out the book that my family hates, but I love. They're just tired of me talking about it. It's John Carse's Finite and Infinite Games.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about that now. Yeah, share about it.
Yeah, well, good. John Carse was a religion professor at NYU, and I believe this book was published in mid to late 70s. I could be wrong on that. And I'll tell you just an interesting side story is that I found this book at a beach condo on vacation. And it had rained all week, and so I'd ran out of the books that I had brought to read. That's kind of what I like to do at the beach. And so I picked up this book, and we had one more week of being at the beach. And, by the end of that week, and this is my maybe proviso to anybody listening, should you decide to read this book, you are to make no major life decisions while doing so. This book will screw you up. And it certainly did for me. And, to be specific about that point, it really alerted me to who I had become in the way that I'd been socialized to think. And it wasn't my fault, and it wasn't anybody's fault. It's just, as you go through education, you transcend, or you go through multiple of what Carse calls the finite games. Right. And largely, his theory is that whenever we get multiple people together, that we see each other in one of these two ways. Right. And the finite game he defines as, and maybe the easy way to understand it, to think of a sports contest or a Broadway play. Right. That there's a defined beginning and defined end. That the goal of that game is to win the game. Solely that point. And tangible to our discussion, the goal of the higher ed promotion is to get promoted. And you could argue that in college, the goal of winning that finite game of a semester class was to get that A, right? But implicit in a finite game is that the value of any action is measured solely by its utility in winning the game. And for people that have been in education for a while, I think they'll cringe when I say these words, but it is a harbinger that you're talking to somebody that is mentally fully in a finite game. And The words are, is this going to be on the exam, right? Because implicit in that is, if it's not going to be on the exam, then there's no utility in learning it, right? The goal of that course was to get the A. And a couple other elements to it that I think were, frankly disturbing to me, because what he was describing was me. I had become a master of playing finite games, and the number of courses I took and the number of A's that I got, et cetera, et cetera. But implicit in that finite game, too, is that you are an abstraction of yourself. You're playing a role, like an actor in a play, right? And really all optics on how you choose to do what you do and what you devote yourself to are defined by, hey, how does this help me win that game? In contrast, he also describes infinite games, which, the example I use is, as I try to teach people this, it was that space when you were a kid, right? I mean, after school, you'd be playing out on the playground with, your buddies, and maybe it's kick the can or dodgeball or flag football or whatever. And in that space, one of the teams starts to win and really win, right? And the question becomes, what do kids do when one team starts to really win? And the answer is, well, they change the rules, right? So they'll switch quarterbacks, or, hey, you throw the ball off the garage and bounce it into the hoop, and your team gets 36 points, right? They try to reset the game for the sole purpose just to keep playing, just to push the sun back up in the sky for 1 hour before mom calls you home. The goal of the infinite game is just to play for no other reason than to play, right? Mm-hmm. And in education, you might balance it by saying this. It's learning for learning's sake. It's not learning for the exam. It's seeing each other as people, right? That we were friends out on that playground. We weren't, I'm on my team playing this role and you're on that team playing that role. So you sum it all up and say, well, am I suggesting that we should just all check out and go to Walden Pond and pick daisies? Mm-hmm. No. The reality is there's nothing wrong with finite games. I mean, educational literature is pretty clear that, grades in some way do inspire, and high-stakes tests or somewhere on that spectrum inspire people to study harder, learn harder, perform better. And in educational, for those of us in the profession of education, then for sure, you don't win your finite games, meaning getting the awards or getting the grants or whatever, then you don't get to keep playing. Absolutely nothing wrong with it. Where it is a problem is where finite games start to compromise infinite games, where we're so focused on getting a promotion, so focused on getting the award, that we lose sight of while we were playing this sport to begin with, right? And I think that's the balance, that you do what you got to do in the way of getting the appropriate recognition and getting the grants, etc., but never at the expense of that art that we have in the way of improving performance, right? Independent of whether we're recognized or not, which gets to the whole coaching philosophy of, how do you make people better?
Do you find yourself now still being tempted toward the finite games? Do you have to constantly be working and reflecting to focus on the infinite play? Or is this something that now just comes completely naturally to you?
No, I'm still Jeff Wiese. I'm not Yoda or anything. So I'll be clear that I'm not judging anybody that has been. And I also want to be real clear. Listen, I was a Jedi master of finite games. I mean, you gave me a game, you set the rules, I'd figure out a way to win that game. I think that's what had sort of messed me up so much when I've read that book and looked at my life. And to answer your question, no, the temptation is still there. And it does require a lot of reflection, a lot of reassessment of, wow, am I still on course for, my mission and purpose, which is to change this world and make it a better place? Or am I just responding to what game has been put in front of me? And it can become really, really tempting. Now, I had the luxury of, I guess, winning enough of those games that, eventually got promoted, found myself in a tenure space. But, once I was there, that was the point that I said, all right, the awards were just too tempting. And in 2008, I just stopped accepting them across the board. Just will not accept it, so don't nominate and don't offer. And the great part, maybe that's what tenure was for. I don't know. But the great part is once I had made that transition, one, there was a period of withdrawal where, wow, am I still comfortable who I am without that external validation? But the quality of my coaching and the way of making people better went through the roof. I could focus just on them and not on me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So again, I'll make the point. Nothing wrong with finite games. It just, you got to guard and protect against the finite games getting in the way of what you're really about. As early teachers taught me, hey, never let education get in the way of learning, and which might be another way of just saying what I had took me 10 minutes to say. So,
how does your view of teacher as coach make for better physicians?
Well, and again, it may not be unique to medicine. The more I've reflected on our conversation before we had it, because I think it's maybe true in any profession, but at the end of the day, what somebody knows is not as important to me as what they can do. Can they take what is in their head and put it in the act for us, for our profession, for the benefit of the patient, right? But I could easily flip it around and say, well, for a professional, high school, grade school teacher, what that teacher knows is that as important as the ability to take what they do know and to make for better learners, right, to advance their students. And in medicine, it's just very tangible, right? And you meet this all on the pathway to becoming a physician, that there are some people that just have, every piece of knowledge that's out there, they know it, but they just can't do anything with it. And on the flip side, you have people that maybe don't know as much, but are really good at applying what they do know. And in today's day and age, it becomes even more salient, I think, because, back when I was training as a physician, it kind of was what was in your brain, and then you had a little book that you kept in your lab coat that you kept notes and stuff to help you remind you what to do. But now, my students, residents, they all have a smartphone. They're a click away from UpToDate or the internet or, some other resource that getting that knowledge is easy for them. The question is, do they know where to look for it, which is its own skill? And once they have that knowledge, do they know how to apply it, right? Early on, I think this is a core for all of education, but Bloom's taxonomy, right? It was knowledge, skills, and attitudes. And I think years ago, we were so focused on knowledge because our students didn't have an access to get knowledge elsewhere. Now, getting the knowledge is pretty easy for them. And the shift of becoming a great coach is much more of moving towards, some of the skills, showing you how to do it, how to apply it. But a big part of what I find myself doing as an educator now is in large part socialization. Mm-hmm. That is to say, the attitudes of not telling people what to think, but teaching people how to think and how to see the world with different paradigms and different attitudes, which makes for better performance.
When you talk about socialization, I was actually going to ask this earlier on when you were talking about the infinite games. If you're going to attempt to shape your learning culture to be one where students enjoy learning for learning's sake, you're definitely going to have to socialize them for that, because in their case, much of their whole world, I'm guessing, in medical school is all toward the finite games, just like it was for you. And I know that you're very influential at Tulane, but you probably maybe haven't changed the entire medical school. I don't know. Is there still if you're still tempted by it, I suspect it's still ingrained in a culture like that. How do you socialize your students to back away from it being about the book knowledge into the doing?
Right. Well, what you can't do, and I see people that are on the cusp of having this realization, whether they read Carson's books or not. But early on, they're on the cusp of, hey, this has got to be more than just how well you score on the exam. My place in teaching these people is to, improve their lot in life down the road. And the admonishment they'll use, which does not work. In fact, it makes it even worse, right? They'll say, the grades don't matter, and, learn for learning's sake. Don't worry about the grades. And when they say that, they lose ultimate credibility because the students, in my case residents, they know you know that without winning those games, yeah, this whole thing doesn't go the way that I wanted it to go. And so you can't do that. I think what I try to do is acknowledge, hey, listen, here's what a finite game is, and you got to win this game, right? So focus on that. But the two things I try to balance with that is, one, I'm going to help you win that game, okay? It'll be up to you whether you gain the knowledge and you can apply it, you score well on that exam. But here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to help you get that A that you're after, okay? And implicit in that is Stephen Covey would say, well, a need satisfied no longer motivates, right? So once I can put their mind at rest, that I'll help you win that finite game. But as a quid pro quo, I want you just to visualize, which is one of the core components of clinical coaching. Visualize yourself after this is all done, right? Because this finite game will end, and we will both transcend this. And in 5 years, where are you going to be? And what will you need to know? What will you need to be able to do to really succeed in that space? And as a quid pro quo for helping you, do well on that exam or in this course, you give me that time too, right? To help me help you be the person you want to be 5, 10 years from now when all this stuff is done. That's part of it. And then there's the added, this will be the psychology part of me as a coach, of getting people to act their way into a new belief with that central tenet that it is easier to act your way into a new belief than it is to believe your way into new actions, right? Mm-hmm. And some of the actions that you can get people to engage in that start moving them from that finite space to the infinite space begins with how you design your education to begin with, right? So as an example, and, again, once I had this epiphany, this is how it started to change the Tulane curriculum, or at least for what I do for our resident physicians here. We moved away from the one person at the podium doing a didactic session, and we moved towards group-based teaching, right? So people at their individual tables or, groups around our 5 tables, still with some lecturettes where there's instruction, but moving towards, okay, let's go through our case discussion. Let's identify things that as a group we don't know, and then each person is assigned to do some research on that topic and come back and teach it to the group. Okay? Pragmatically, it's just easier, less faculty time, but importantly, the philosophical hidden curriculum lesson that I'm trying to teach them is that they are their brother and sister's keeper, right? Which is very much an infinite way of seeing each other, that by taking your time to make other people better, now we're transcending the are you going to get an A and more getting them to focus on each other. That makes sense?
Yeah, and as part of this also, one of your approaches you use to teach people how to think versus teaching them what to think?
Yeah, and it's, I do a lot of, grand rounds or visiting professorships these days around the country, and that's really been the central tenet that, again, the more I do this, I think it's less of teaching people what to think and teaching them how to think, how to see each other, and how to view the world around them. I'll give you another example that, may not come up for everybody in the teaching space, but for us in medicine, it becomes very, very important when we get into feedback and evaluation, and how do we coach people based upon their performance and ostensibly improve their subsequent performance, right? So at the middle of every rotation, which, in medicine is usually about a month long, middle of the rotation are going to be some time with the people that you're coaching and teaching to say, hey, this is what you've done right, and here's how you improve. And then at the end of it is more about a summative evaluation of, here's how the month went, and here were the strengths and weaknesses. Well, classically, that feedback and evaluation has been sort of the feedback sandwich, right? Here's what you did right, mm-hmm. right? But here's what you could do better, and then just to emotionally confuse them, here's some more stuff that I like about you. What I try to coach our folks on is what I call feedback pizza, and
I've never heard that before.
Yeah, well, I think I made that up, though it's possible subconsciously I absorbed it from somebody smarter than me. The sandwich is great. I mean, it's great until it's you being sandwiched, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. The example I give, I go home and my wife starts telling me, "Oh, thanks for cleaning the yard and picking up your clothes," and then I think, "Wow, who is this person and what did you do with my wife? My wife doesn't compliment me." And then it dawns on me that I'm getting sandwiched, right? I'm like, "Oh man," and then everything just turns to Charlie Brown teacher voice, right? I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop, but, and then comes the heat, right, of all the things I need to be doing better. Nothing wrong with it. It's just psychologically the word but, which is requisite for the sandwich, right? The word but signals a finite game. It signals the end of a finite game. Here's all the stuff you did well, but here's where you came up short. And if you just make one word substitution, which moves the sandwich to the pizza, right? Just 2 layers instead of 3. Here's all the things that you did right, and next time here's how you could do even better. But the word "and" is infinite. It means that something's coming after it, not that the game was closed. And it seems like a trivial sort of thing, but psychologically it changes everything for the person receiving that feedback and evaluation. Psychologically, and metaphorically, what you're communicating to that person is, hey, congratulations, you won the gold medal. And next time, if you did this is how you'd set the world record. It signals success and motivation to do even better, as opposed to, where you came up on the measure of winning or losing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's those small sort of words that, or small sort of tactics that I think start to move people from the finite game to the infinite game. Quickly, I'll give you another example. Where in the middle of a rotation, I used to sit down and go through, all the skills that we're assessing them on, and you did well on this, and you did, poorly on that. Now I don't. I write out 10 things that I think are really core for what I wanted somebody to learn, knowledge, skills, and attitudes in that rotation. And I sit down with them, and I give them a penny, and I have a penny. And I say, hey, listen, put your penny on your weakest area, and I'm going to put my penny on what I think your weakest area is, and now let's spend some time talking about how we improve those weakest areas. No commentary on how they did, right? It's not saying that you won or you didn't win. And implicitly what it is saying is that wherever you are in life, however smart you are, top of the class, middle of the class, bottom of the class, you could always be better. And the way that you go from good to great is by finding your weakest area and improving it. But a very forward-looking mentality, which is that infinite game. Always improve, right? Don't get so caught in just how well you did in this particular rotation or this particular class.
How do you coach students to be effective in an environment where there are absolutely no absolutes?
Yeah, and this is tough, and I'll tell you, in medicine, it's really, really tough, and it's not unique to medicine. The higher you go in education, I'm sure people in PhD courses would say the same thing, that you start dealing with a population of people that have always won, right? But they were the smartest people in their high school, then the smartest people in their college, and then med school, and eventually you get to a level that, regardless of how smart they are, now just what they're up against in the world, for us it's medicine, is just really, really hard. I mean, you're dealing with disease, you're dealing with lives and personalities and the complexities of life, and that can be shocking for them. We see this a lot as students move out of the classroom in the second year medical school and move to the third year medical school, where it's real life now. We're dealing not with simulated patients, but real patients with life stories. And for a lot of them, it shakes them. It shakes them real good. But getting back to Karst, one of my favorite lines in that book, because he talks about the role of education in finite, infinite games, and he makes the point that training is to prevent surprise, right? Education is to prepare for surprise, which I love, because a big part of what I'm doing in the way of educating is preparing them for a day when everything isn't according to Hoyle, right? That this disease doesn't look exactly the way that it should, or that this person has, multiple conditions or maybe rare symptoms for a common disease. And how do you think your way through that? And, for us, it's very much, right back to that MO of understanding becoming more important than factual acquisition. how do you understand the world working around you, and teaching people. But you understand that getting into that, teaching people how to understand a disease, et cetera. Again, I think in other domains they'd have similar analogies. Frequently is not on a multiple choice test. Multiple choice test just not designed for that, right? And so if you're really trying to educate, which is much more about learning and understanding and getting people to see the world in a different way, then in some ways that competes against what will be rewarded on that finite game exam. But I think at the end of the day, that's what has made people like Jeff Connors, so I'm very, very proud of, very, very successful. The ability to get into foreign situations that he's never seen before and then work his way through it and still succeed.
Yeah, one of the other things that certainly he exemplifies is professionalism. So before we move on to the recommendations part of the show, I'm just curious, how do you instill professionalism in your students?
Well, yeah, man, I could spend an hour talking about that because it becomes so important. But, I'll take you back to the Reformation. I mean, that was sort of the point of the Reformation, right? I mean, there were 99 theses, but really at its core, as Martin Luther put it, was that, and I'm going to use this religious part, that's what it was, but I'm using that more as a metaphor for where I'm going in teaching professionalism. But, Martin Luther put it that up to that point, you could only profess your love of God by being in the clergy, but you didn't necessarily have to be in the clergy. You could profess your love of God by what you did and whatever you did, right? Now I'm going to skip the God part and just go to where I abstract from that I think professionalism at its core is professing who you are and what you do, right? As Stephen Covey puts it, that everybody has three lives. You have your public life, your private life, and then your true core life that you may or may not be in touch with. But the true professional has all three of those lives aligned, that you profess who you are in your core and in your private and your public, but there's no inconsistencies, right? Put it another way, that professionalism is the ability to subordinate feelings and conditions to values based upon your principles. Principles being your core life, and that should be synonymous with your private life. But when you go public, now it's, even if I don't want to do something, if it is synonymous with my values and principles, that is to say, I know this to be the right thing to do, that you still do it, right? And in medicine, it may be, hey, finally got some time to get a hamburger at the cafeteria, you sit down, you're about to, and let's just pretend that the cafeteria hamburger is going to be tasty, but you're about to eat it, and you get the call, this patient needs you. What do? Do you put the hamburger down, leave it, go take care of the patient, or do you finish your burger and then see the patient when it's convenient? And the definition of a professional to me is, again, that ability to subordinate those feelings for what I know to be true and right. And in teaching people professionalism, two things. One, I think it's, and I will do this with my students and residents, just say the words that I just said to you. That's what I see a professional to be. Not somebody that makes money. That's not why they are a professional. And not somebody that's following a script, right? And just to circle quickly back again to that finite infinite games thing, but if you're in that finite game and you've been socialized to think finitely, then again, in a finite game, you're playing a role. You're an abstraction of yourself, right? The role of doctor today will be played by this student. And you're given a costume, you're given a script, and you're told this is what you should say, which in some ways is antithetical to teaching true professionalism, which is, it's not about the script, it's not about the role, it's about you. What you believe, your values, principles, do you manifest those in what you do for your patients? And if you can get people to see that, and then add to the second piece, which is one of my favorite books by Viktor Frankl, Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks about, the last of the human freedoms. Between stimulus and response, everybody has a choice you may not choose the stimulus. You may have no say in what stimulus happens to you, but everybody still has that freedom to respond to that stimulus. And how will you respond to it, right? So something bad happens, a professional is somebody that's going to do the right thing, again, concordant with their values and beliefs, even if it's uncomfortable. right? And getting people to see that you're not locked in Peter Berger's bad faith, that you have no choice. You'll always have a choice, right? As my residents will tell you, central MO of the training program is all you have to do in life is die. Everything else is a choice. And once you're in that space, now our professionalism is going to be measured by the choices that you make, right? Responsible is to be response-able, knowing that you have the ability to respond to the stimuli that happen to you.
This is the point in the show where we each give a recommendation. And when I had the opportunity to go back and look at your teaching portfolio again and just think and reflect and read more about your coaching philosophy and how that manifests itself in your teaching, it reminded me of a book that I finished recently called Spare Parts: 4 Undocumented Teenagers, One Ugly Robot, and the Battle for the American Dream. And it's just this wonderful story. It's the classic David and Goliath story. It's a nonfiction book and chronicles a couple of science teachers in Arizona who inspire these young men to get together and apply for and then go compete in an underwater robot competition. And it's one of those things where there are, I think, something like 9 or 10 different challenges that they want the robots to be able to do, to measure things, to float, and to be able to move around with a certain level of speed. And they're competing against teams from very prestigious universities such as MIT. And in this case, MIT was backed by ExxonMobil with a grant of $10,000. And these guys don't have any money. Their families don't have any money. They cobble together through some donations of parts and things like that, less than $1,000. And they build this robot that they named Stinky. And I'm not going to give anything away other than to say I was so inspired, especially by these teachers. I mean, these men have just given their lives in so many ways to these students and stood back sometimes when the students were challenged and let them troubleshoot and figure it out and let them pick up the phone and call companies. They'd never called companies before in their lives and talk to them. In fact, some of the companies they called really liked them so much because they were just curious little learners about how do these things work and how do you use this part in your business and how do you think it might work in our robot? And it was just a really great read. It's a quick read and super inspiring. I would recommend it. So what is your recommendation for people listening today?
Well, first, thanks for that description, because while you were describing that, I was ordering it on Amazon. So I am looking forward to that book.
Oh, it's awesome. Great. It's great.
Well, my recommendation, I've already alluded to a few of the books during our discussion here, but one of the books I didn't talk about that is still one of my all-time favorites is called Strangers to Ourselves, which is about the adaptive unconscious, written by Timothy Wilson. Unlike your recommendation, Bonnie, it's probably not a light, quick read, but it's worth having on the shelf just to read and think about over the course of 4 or 5 months. But what I love about it is, that Timothy Wilson talks about how, I'll put it this way, practice doesn't make perfect, which in some ways has been sort of a truism underlying all education all the way through. He makes the corrective piece that it's perfect practice that makes perfect, and perfect practice you could define as reflection. That is, to do the skill, to try it, but then always to be looking back and reflect, hey, how could have that been done better? And talks a lot about the adaptive unconscious, how it seeps into us, how it changes our world, and power of reflection can get us to see the world in a different way. It's, at the end of the day, a fantastic read.
Well, Jeff, I just appreciate, I truly do, you accepting my email and getting back to me quick and being willing to invest your time. I know you have a really busy career there as you are coaching your students, and I just really appreciate it. And I think that it'll mean a lot to your former student too, that you were willing to just come on and share with even a broader audience. Thank you so much. Well,
you're welcome, Bonnie. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you again to Dr. Jeff Wiese for investing your time in the teaching in higher ed community. It was such an honor to get to speak to you and hear about how you use coaching to teach your residents. Those of you who are listening who want to follow up on the episode and leave comments, feedback, you can do so at teachinginhighered.com/96. And if you have yet to subscribe to the weekly update, you can get the show notes in your inbox every week automatically, just a single email a week with those show notes and oftentimes an article about teaching or productivity written by me. You can subscribe at teachinginhighered.com/subscribe. Thanks to all of you who have been leaving reviews on iTunes or whatever service it is you use to listen to the show. It really helps other people discover the show and build our community even further. So I hope you'll continue to do that so that we can attract even more wonderful guests such as Dr. Jeff Wiese. And send your suggestions to me as well. You can do that at teachinginhighered.com/feedback. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.